Abraham Lincoln is right. Now, 3,000 years ago in Egypt, do you know who freed the Hebrew people from slavery? Benny? Moses did. Moses. And we're going to find out much more about that. And once a year, the Jewish people in Israel and all over the world celebrate their freedom with the holiday of Passover. So our drawing story today is going to tell you how Moses freed the Hebrews as it's written in the Bible. I'm going to start now. Thousands of years ago, many Hebrew people lived in Egypt, where they'd come for food, and they lived very happily until there was a new pharaoh, or a new king, who was very cruel, and he made slaves out of all the Hebrew people, and he had many of them killed. Well, our story begins one day at the bank of the river Nile. Now, there was a little baby boy who was left in a basket right at the edge of the river in the long grass. Did anybody know who the baby was? Do you know, Benny? Who was it? Moses. It was the baby Moses, that's right. Well, his mother had left him there on purpose, because she hoped that if the Pharaoh's daughter found the baby, she'd rescue him, and that way the baby wouldn't be killed. Well, his mother was right, and the princess did find the baby, and she adopted him, and she took him home. But it was his mother who was the one who took care of him and who brought him up. And so he always knew that he was a Hebrew. Well, as he grew up, he was... What, dear? Yes, you do? Well, we'll find out more right now. As he grew up, Moses was very unhappy about the way his people were being treated and how they were forced to be slaves and to work so hard. And one day, when he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, he got so angry that he killed the Egyptian and he fled to the desert. Well, he became a shepherd on the desert, which means he tended sheep. And he grew a long beard, and he dressed in shepherd's robes, the way the people dress on the desert. One day, while he was tending his flock of sheep, he saw some flames spring up from a bush, and an angel of the Lord appeared. In the flames, he called Moses' name. Well, Moses covered his eyes with his hands, for he was afraid to look upon God. And the Lord commanded Moses to go to the Pharaoh and to say to him, "Let my people go," and to lead the Hebrews out of this land to the land of milk and honey. Well, let's see what happened when Moses went to the Pharaoh's palace. Here we are in Egypt. And here are the Hebrew slaves working very hard, making bricks out of mud. And this man is an Egyptian who's beating them and making them work harder and harder and harder. And then the Pharaoh made them work even harder, and he took away the straw. And they had to make the bricks just out of mud with little bits of straw that they had to find themselves. Well, here was Moses and his brother Aaron. And they watched the man beating the slaves, and Moses got very angry. And he asked his brother Aaron to go with him to the Pharaoh, because Moses stuttered. He didn't speak very well, and he wanted his brother Aaron to speak for him. He didn't speak very well. He was a very great leader. And so they walked to the Pharaoh's palace, which was a very splendid one indeed. And they went inside. And there was the Pharaoh sitting on his throne. And Moses said to the Pharaoh, as the Lord had told him to, he said, "Let my people go." But the Pharaoh's heart was very hard, and he refused. And then the Lord spoke again to Moses, and he told him to go back to the Pharaoh and to throw down his stick on the ground before him. And so Moses did. He threw his stick down on the ground, just as the Lord had told him to. And then the stick suddenly became a snake. And everybody was frightened. And then the Pharaoh lifted his scepter and said, "Stop!" And Moses picked up his stick by the head, and it became stiff again. Well, the Pharaoh had promised to let the people go, but he didn't keep his promise. He was very stubborn, and his heart was very hard again. And so the Lord said to Moses, "I will send down plagues upon the Pharaoh to convince him to let my people go." So the Lord sent plagues down, each one worse than the last. Does anybody know what some of the plagues were? Do you know what some of the plagues were, Benny? What? Blood. There was blood, and there was what else, Jessica? Yes. And there was rocks. There were rocks, and there was darkness, and there were frogs. You know that? One of the plagues was frogs. Frogs came out of everywhere. And they went everywhere. Millions of frogs. They went into the food. They went into people's houses. And again the Pharaoh lifted his scepter and said, "Stop!" And so Moses let the frogs go away. But the Pharaoh still didn't let the people go. And so the Lord was still very angry, and he sent more plagues, and this time he sent hail. And everything, hail came all over everything until the Pharaoh lifted his scepter and said, "Stop!" And then the hail stopped, but he still didn't let the people go. And the Lord got very, very angry. And so the Lord said that he was going to send down the worst plague of all, which was that the oldest child in every Egyptian home would have to die. But first, the Lord told Moses to prepare the Hebrew people. They should sacrifice a lamb and mark for the Lord. And they should mark their doorways so that the angel of the Lord would know to pass over the Hebrew homes. Well, that's what came to pass. And here are the homes of the Hebrew people. And they sacrificed the lamb, and they marked their doorways. And sure enough, the firstborn of all the Egyptian people died, but the firstborn of the Hebrews were spared, because the angel of the Lord had passed over the Hebrew houses. And that's how, or one of the ways that the word Passover came to be used for the Passover holiday. Well, this time, the Pharaoh said to Moses and Aaron that the Hebrews could finally be free, but they would have to leave very quickly. So Moses and Aaron went to call their people. Now the people had to leave so quickly that they needed food for the journey, and they were going to take bread, but they had to take the bread before it was leavened, which means it wouldn't dry. And so they put the bread on their backs, and as they crossed the hot desert, the bread baked. And it became what we today call matzah. And Moses and Aaron led the people across the desert. And the Bible says that the Lord led 600,000 Hebrews, men, women, and children, towards the land of Israel across the wilderness. When the Pharaoh realized that all his slaves had really left, he wasn't very happy. And he decided to try to get his slaves back. And so he called all his chariots and his army to pursue the Hebrews. And the chariots left. And when the Hebrew people turned around and saw the chariots chasing them, they were very frightened. What would they do? And so the Lord said to Moses, "Lift up thy stick, and stretch out thy hand over the sea, and divide it, and the children of Israel shall go into the midst of the sea on dry ground." Well, Moses did as his Lord commanded. And sure enough, clouds formed, and the east wind blew, and the waters divided. And Moses and Aaron led their way into the sea. And crossed on dry ground. And then the rest of their people followed right into the sea and across the dry ground. And then the Egyptian chariots followed. And they got closer and closer and closer, and then they headed for the sea too. And the people hurried, and they were very, very frightened. They didn't know what to do. And then Moses stretched forth his hand again, and he commanded the waters to rise again. And when the Egyptian chariots got into the Red Sea, sure enough, the water rose and covered them. It was a very Egyptian army was lost at sea, and the Hebrew people were free. And then Miriam, Moses' sister, had a drum like this one, and she led the women and children in song and dance to celebrate their freedom. And then for 40 years, the Hebrew people went across the desert until they reached the Holy Land, which was called the land of milk and honey, and which is once again today called Israel. And now every year, the Jewish people celebrate the freedom of their ancestors from Egypt, and they celebrate in a holiday called Passover.